The handwritten cards were still on the desks when she left. On the morning of June 14, 1990, in the hallways of Bryson Elementary School in McDowell County, West Virginia, the last day of the school year arrived the way it always did, with the particular energy of children who have been building toward this moment for weeks. Backpacks emptied and refilled with permission slips and crayon drawings and the accumulated paperwork of a year. Lockers stripped of everything personal. The smell of chalk dust and industrial cleaner and the specific warmth of a school building in June when all the windows had been opened for the first time since March. Margaret Toll, Maggie, to everyone who knew her, had been at her desk since 7:30, writing, not grading, not preparing materials, writing cards. One for each of her 23 fifth graders, handwritten, one sentence each. Something she had observed about each child that year, something specific, something that child might not have known anyone had noticed. She did this every last day of school. She had been doing it for 12 years. At 2:47 p.m., the final bell rang, and the children came to her desk one by one for their cards, and several of them hugged her, and she walked them to the door and watched them run toward the buses and the waiting cars and the summer that was finally theirs. At 3:15, her colleague in the next classroom, Joan Ferris, knocked on her open door and asked if she was ready to walk to the parking lot. Maggie said she was going to stay a few more minutes, that she had planned to drive up to the ridge after school to check on the wildflowers she had been mapping, and that she would see Joan at the end of year gathering that evening. She was at her desk, alone, in a classroom that still smelled of chalk and 23 children's summer hopes. What happened in the hours between that last goodbye and the moment Joan Ferris realized Maggie had not arrived at the gathering would consume McDowell County for 33 years and would finally be answered not by a state crime lab or a federal database, but by the 23 children from that last class, grown up and determined, searching a ridge above their hometown with their own hands in the spring of 2023. But before we get to what they found, we have to go back to that June morning. Because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Maggie Toll was. McDowell County in 1990 was coal country in the specific way of a place that has built its entire identity around an industry and is in the process of watching that industry leave. The Slab Fork mines had been closing or scaling back since the mid-1980s, and by 1990 the county's population had been declining for a decade and the particular social strain of a community losing its economic reason for being was visible in the shuttered storefronts on the main road and the men who gathered at the diner in the mornings because they had nowhere particular to be. But alongside that strain, held up by the institutions that outlast industrial cycles, the churches, the schools, the volunteer fire departments, the women who organized the county fair every September without being asked and without stopping, there was still the stubborn warmth of a place that knew its own people and looked after them. Maggie Toll had grown up in Bryson. Her father had worked the Slab Fork operation for 30 years. She had gone to West Virginia University on a scholarship, come home with a teaching degree, and started at Bryson Elementary in 1978 at 22 years old. The same year she married a man named Paul Toll, who worked at the county road department. They had no children. What she had instead, in the way that some teachers have instead, was 23 new children every September, and a commitment to learning each of them completely before June. She was 34 years old in the summer of 1990 and had been teaching 5th grade for 12 years, long enough that the older siblings of her current students remembered her from when they had been in her class, long enough that parents in the grocery store would stop her to report that their now adult children still talked about her. She kept her classroom decorated with her students' artwork year-round, not just during the school year, but through the summer, when the building was empty. because she wanted it to be ready when they came back in September, and she wanted the work from one class to be there when the next one arrived. A kind of continuity she considered important, and that the school administration had long since stopped questioning. The cards were the thing her former students talked about most, the specific detail of them, not a generic, "you're a great student." Have a wonderful summer, but something true and observed. I noticed that you always checked whether the quieter kids understood before you raised your hand. Or the way you helped Marcus with the reading project, without making it obvious, was one of the best things I saw this year. Things she had been paying attention to all year, held until the last day, delivered in her handwriting on index cards she bought with her own money. Her former students kept them. Not all of them, but most. Teresa Holbrook, who would grow up to be Teresa Vance, civil engineer, and who would spend 18 months organizing a geological survey of the ridge above Bryson, had kept hers in the same envelope since June 14, 1990. She had been 10 years old. The card said, "You figure out how things work before you ask for help, and that is going to take you very far." Paul Tolley had been at the County Road Department on the afternoon of June 14, 1990. He expected Maggie home by 6. She had mentioned the ridge walk. He had said to be careful on the switchback road. She had said she always was. She never came home. Paul Toll called Joan Ferris at 7:45 p.m., when Maggie had not arrived at the end-of-year gathering and had not called. Joan called 2 other colleagues. By 8:30, Paul had driven the Ridge Road himself and found Maggie's 1987 Subaru wagon parked at the trailhead pull-off on County Route 12, locked, with her school bag on the passenger seat, and her keys on the driver's side floor mat as though they had been dropped in a hurry or knocked from her hand. He called the McDowell County Sheriff's Department at 8:52 p.m. Deputy Sheriff Carl Briggs responded. He was 37 years old, one of 4 deputies covering a county of 35,000 people across more than 500 square miles of mountain terrain. He was thorough. He was experienced. He was working 3 other active cases. He had no forensic support, no dedicated investigative unit, and a department budget that had been cut twice in the preceding 3 years as the county's tax base eroded with the mines. He documented the scene, secured the vehicle, and organized a search that began at first light on June 15th. The search ran for 6 days before the resources were redirected. 6 days across the ridge system east of Bryson, through creek drainages and mine roads and the old Slab Fork access cuts that ran deep into the hillsides. Volunteers came out. The community did what communities do, organizing itself into search teams, the same people who ran the county fair and coached Little League walking the ridgelines in the June heat. They covered accessible terrain. They did not find Maggie Tolley. Briggs identified 2 persons of interest in the first month. The first was a man from the neighboring county who had been seen in the area and whose background check revealed a prior conviction. He was interviewed twice and eliminated. The second name came in through a neighbor of Paul Tolley's who mentioned, in passing, that a man she knew as Raymond Ott had been seen on the Ridge Road in the days before Maggie disappeared. Briggs had Ott's name in his log by the 4th week of the investigation. He arranged an interview for week 5. Ott appeared, answered questions about his general movements in June, said he walked the ridge roads regularly because he had nothing else to do since Slab Fork closed, and left. Briggs noted him as a person of interest and flagged the file for follow-up. The follow-up was scheduled. It was not completed. A domestic violence case in the southern end of the county required Briggs for 2 weeks in August. When he returned to the toll file in September, Raymond Ott had moved to a property in Mingo County, and his forwarding address was incomplete. The follow-up lapsed. That lapse was not negligence, in the conventional sense. It was poverty. 4 deputies, 500 square miles, and a community in economic distress that generated more emergency calls every month than the previous month. Briggs carried the weight of it. He requested additional investigative resources from the state twice and was told both times that the caseload criteria for state intervention had not been met. He kept the toll file on his active desk until he retired in 2008. He kept a copy in his house after that. Paul Toll was 36 years old when his wife disappeared. He stayed in Bryson for 11 years. He never remarried. He moved to Beckley in 2001, closer to his sister's family. He came back to Bryson twice a year, at Christmas and on June 14th. He was precise about the date. By 1995, 5 years after the disappearance, 15 of Maggie's 23 former students had organized the first June gathering in the parking lot of Bryson Elementary School. They had been 10 years old when she disappeared. They were 15 now. One of them, a boy named Kevin Draper, had suggested it without knowing quite what he was suggesting, and the others had agreed without knowing quite what they were agreeing to. And they had stood in the parking lot and read their cards aloud, one by one, and it had taken about 12 minutes, and when it was done, nobody had moved for a while. They had been doing it every June since. By 2002, 12 years after Maggie disappeared, Bryson Elementary School had consolidated with 2 other schools in the county, and the building had been converted to a community center. The parking lot where the former students gathered was cracked and weedy at the edges, but still there. 14 of them still came. Kevin Draper drove from Columbus. Teresa Vance drove from Charleston. They were 22 years old now, old enough to understand the full shape of what had happened, and young enough that the understanding still produced something close to rage alongside the grief. By 2010, 20 years after, Carl Briggs had been retired for 2 years. He kept Raymond Ott's name in a folder he reviewed twice a year. Ott was living in Mingo County, collecting disability payments, 61 years old. Briggs had no new evidence. He had the name, the geography, and a conviction that held no legal weight. By 2015, Paul Toll was 61 years old, living in Beckley, still driving to Bryson twice a year. The Subaru wagon had been released back to him in 1991 after processing. He had sold it. He could not account for why he had sold it rather than keeping it, except that keeping it had seemed like the wrong direction and selling it had seemed like the slightly less wrong direction, which was the best he could do at the time. Teresa Vance had become a civil engineer. She specialized in drainage infrastructure, culverts, retaining walls, slope stability. She had chosen the field, if she was honest with herself, because of the ridge above Bryson. Because of the years she had spent looking at it from below and thinking about what it held. She had the engineering vocabulary now to do something about that thinking. She had 2 colleagues from the original class who had also gone into technical fields. She had been planning the survey for 3 years before she formally proposed it to the group in the fall of 2021. The Bryson 5th grade class of 1990, 15 adults in their late 30s, raised $34,000 over 8 months through a combination of personal contributions and a crowdfunding campaign that spread further than they expected, reaching people across West Virginia and beyond who had followed the case and who had, like them, never stopped thinking about Maggie Toll. They hired a private investigation firm based in Morgantown to advise on the forensic methodology. They organized the survey in 3 phases across the spring of 2022 and 2023, covering the ridge system above Bryson in sections, using ground-penetrating radar equipment operated by Teresa and her colleagues. Teresa had read her card so many times she no longer needed to read it. She had it memorized. You figure out how things work before you ask for help, and that is going to take you very far. She had been taking it very far for 33 years. The work that made this case finally move required years of patient research, source verification, and careful documentation. If you believe that kind of work matters, that Maggie Toll's story deserves to be known, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop us a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get back to Bryson. On the morning of April 19, 2023, Teresa Vance was working the third sector of the Ridge Survey alone, covering the section of drainage infrastructure east of the old Slab Fork access road, when she stopped at the entrance to one of the mine drainage tunnels that cut horizontally into the hillside. The tunnel was old, pre-1970 construction, half collapsed at its interior end, the stone facing of its entrance loose and settling. She had been noting loose stone faces throughout the survey for structural documentation. She ran her light along the wall and saw, in the gap between a displaced stone and the tunnel face behind it, something that was not stone. She reached in with her hand. It was a notebook. Green cover. Water-resistant pages of the kind used by surveyors and field researchers. The Write in the Rain brand, which she recognized because she used the same kind herself. It was in a sealed plastic sleeve that it mostly held. She opened the sleeve. She opened the notebook. The handwriting on the first page was Maggie Toll's. Teresa had seen it on a card she had been keeping for 33 years. She recognized it immediately. The particular slope of the capital letters, the way the M in Margaret curved. She did not need to read the name on the inside cover to know whose notebook she was holding. But she read it anyway. She sat down on the slope outside the tunnel entrance and held the notebook in both hands and did not move for a while. Below her, the town of Bryson was visible in the April morning, small and quiet, the old school building and the church steeples and the ridge road running down to the valley floor. She had grown up looking at this view from below. She had spent 33 years trying to understand what it held. She called the private investigation firm. Then she called Paul Toll. Then she called Kevin Draper, who was in his car in Columbus when the call came in and who pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat there for 20 minutes before he could drive again. The notebook was turned over to the McDowell County Sheriff's Office, which contacted the West Virginia State Police. Detective Sergeant Laura Hensley of the WV State Police Cold Case Unit was assigned the case on April 21, 2023. She read the notebook that afternoon at the evidence lab in Charleston. Maggie Toll's field notebook documented 14 months of wildflower surveys on the ridge above Bryson from April 1989 through June 1990. It contained botanical notes, hand-drawn maps, GPS coordinates recorded from a handheld unit she had borrowed from the science department, and pressed specimens taped to several pages. In the back of the notebook, in a section separated from the botanical records by a folded sheet, were 6 entries written in a different register, not botanical notes but personal observations, dated, specific. The first was from March 12, 1990. It described a man she had encountered on the Ridge Road while returning from a survey. A heavy-set man in a green jacket who had stopped his vehicle and watched her from the road for several minutes without speaking. She had noted his approximate age, his vehicle, a dark blue pickup, older model, no plates visible, and a physical description. The second entry, from April 3rd, noted the same man, same vehicle, at a different point on the Ridge Road. The third, from May 9th, noted him a third time. Closer, the fourth entry was brief. She had looked up Raymond Ott, because the neighbor had mentioned his name once and she had remembered it, and she believed the man on the ridge was him. The fifth entry, from June 7th, said she had intended to mention this to Paul, but had not wanted to alarm him when she wasn't certain. The sixth entry was dated June 14, 1990, the last day of school, and said she was going to the ridge one more time and had decided that if she saw him again, she was going to call the sheriff's office directly when she got home. She had not gotten home. Raymond Ott had lived in Mingo County for 26 years. He was 74 years old in 2023, in moderate health, still living on the same rural property outside Williamson, where he had moved in 1997. His name was in Carl Briggs's old folder. It was in Hensley's file before she had finished reading the notebook. The geographic information in the notebook narrowed the search area on the ridge to a specific drainage section 200 meters east of where Teresa had found the notebook. Ground-penetrating radar on that section, conducted by the State Police Forensic Unit with Teresa Vance's technical assistance, identified a subsurface anomaly at a depth consistent with the time frame. Excavation was authorized on May 14, 2023. What was recovered was submitted to the WV State Medical Examiner's Office. DNA comparison against reference samples provided by Paul Toll confirmed the identification on June 2, 2023, 12 days before the 33rd anniversary of the last day of school. Raymond Ott was arrested at his property outside Williamson on June 9, 2023, by WV State Police detectives. He was 74 years old. He was sitting on his front porch when the vehicles arrived. He watched the officers come up his drive. He did not run. He did not speak until he was in the back of the patrol vehicle, and then he said one thing that was recorded and that became part of the case record. He said, "I thought I took that notebook from her. I've been wondering for 33 years whether I took it." He had not taken it. It had fallen behind the stone when Maggie dropped it, or placed it there, or when it was displaced in the chaos of what happened. It had been in that wall for 33 years, 20 feet from where Maggie had last walked, waiting for someone to put their hand in the right gap. Ott was charged with first-degree murder. He entered a not guilty plea. His trial was scheduled for 2024. In October of 2023, he accepted a plea agreement, guilty to second-degree murder, the reduced charge reflecting evidentiary considerations and his age and health. He was sentenced to 25 years, which at 74 meant the rest of his life. He was remanded to the custody of the West Virginia Division of Corrections. He was in a cell when the Bryson fifth-grade class of 1990 gathered in the parking lot on June 14, 2023, to read their cards. Maggie Toll came to school on the morning of June 14, 1990, and spent the first hours of the day writing 23 handwritten cards for 23 10-year-old children, one sentence each, the things she had been paying attention to all year. She stayed after the bell to make sure each child received theirs. She watched them run toward the summer. She told her colleague she was going to the ridge to check on her wildflowers, because she had been mapping them for 14 months and the documentation mattered to her, and she had been doing it alone. In the hills above her hometown, because the hills above her hometown were beautiful, and she saw no reason they should not be safe. She was 34 years old. She had 12 years of children behind her, and decades more ahead of her. And every year she had given each of them one true sentence about themselves that they might carry forward. She was the kind of teacher who is, in the fullest sense, irreplaceable. Not because no one else could teach fifth grade in Bryson, but because no one else was her. And the specific quality of attention she brought to 23 children every year was hers alone, and ended when she was taken. Teresa Vance stood in the parking lot of the old school on the morning of June 14, 2023, and read her card aloud for the 29th time. You figure out how things work before you ask for help, and that is going to take you very far. She had gone very far. She had gone to West Virginia University and gotten a civil engineering degree and spent her career building things that held. She had spent 18 months and $34,000 and every weekend of 2 springs on a ridge above Bryson. She had put her hand into a gap in a stone wall because she was thorough, and because thoroughness was what the work required, and because Maggie Toll had noticed, 33 years ago, that she figured out how things work. Paul Toll drove to Bryson on June 14, 2023, as he had every year since 1990. He stood in the parking lot with the former students, some of whom he had watched grow up from a distance, and he listened to them read. When Teresa read her card, she looked at him. He nodded. That was all. Some things do not require more than that. The McDowell County investigation led to a formal state review of cold case resources in rural West Virginia counties, a review that documented the specific funding gap that had allowed the 1990 investigation to stall and recommended mandatory state cold case unit involvement in any unsolved homicide after 90 days in counties below a defined investigative capacity threshold. The legislation passed in 2024 and carries the informal designation of the Tolley Standard within the WV State Police Cold Case Division. Carl Briggs was 80 years old when he heard the news. He had Raymond Ott's name in a folder he reviewed twice a year. He took the folder out when the call came. He looked at the name for a while. Then, he put it away. Differently than he had put it away every other time, because this time, he put it away finished. There is a kind of love that expresses itself as attention. Paying close enough attention to another person that you see the specific things about them that they cannot see about themselves, and then finding a way to give that back. Maggie Tolley did that for 12 years, for 23 children at a time, in a coal country school in a county that was losing its reason to stay. The children she gave it to did not forget. They grew up, and they used what she had seen in them, and they came back for her. That is not a small thing. That is everything. Maggie Tolley noticed something true about each of her students and wrote it down for them to keep. 33 years later, the thing she had noticed in one of them, the ability to figure out how things work, is what finally found her. Is there a word for that? Is the sentence Raymond Ott said in the back of that patrol vehicle, "I've been wondering for 33 years whether I took it," a form of justice, or just evidence of how long a person can live with what he did? And for those of you who had a teacher who changed something in you, who noticed something you didn't know anyone was watching, what would it mean to you to know that those students never stopped? Leave your thoughts below. We read every one. Justice found Maggie Toll after 33 years, carried there by the children she taught. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe that truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe. More cases are waiting in the description, and every one of them belongs to someone who deserved better. Thank you for watching.